Hi, Steve Riley. Welcome to Great Practice, Great Life. Today I have my friend and just a terrific guest, Ed Kainen, back. Ed, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Steve.
So today we want to talk about how you were at one point in time enslaved by your practice. Like you couldn't take time away from your practice. Your practice owned you. And then you went through a transition period where you owned the practice. So you couldn't get away from the practice, and now you can totally get away from the practice. And a lot of lawyers don't understand this transformation. And so let's go back to the very beginning. So let's just talk about when you opened your practice, and you had a partner, Howard, as I recall. You and Howard were partners, and then you and Howard split at Howard's choice. He wanted to kind of transition into retirement, and you kind of got jettisoned out. And you were working crazy hours. Like, what were your hours like when, talk to me about what that looked like and what was that like for you?
So I probably start with the foundation that, as being born in 1964, which by most definitions is the last year of the baby boomers, you generationally, at least I was raised to approach work as that was my responsibility, was to work hard and support a family and do what was necessary. And so even before I was in private practice, it was when I was a criminal prosecutor, I was going to be the first one in and the last one out. And I was going to learn everything that needed to be learned if I was going to be the best at what I did. And so that's sort of ingrained in the way I approach things. And so even when I was a prosecutor working for the government, I did that. And then eventually when I was in private practice with my old partner, Howard, it was a new area of law. I wanted to make sure I mastered everything. My disc profile of a high SC means I have to do everything, and make sure everything gets done. So when I was practicing over the probably 16 or 18 years that Howard, I think it was 17 and change, that Howard and I were together, as I looked back on it, every year, no matter what, I would end up with billable hours of 2,150 to 2,200 hours a year. And that breaks down to a little over 180 a month, on average. And I can tell you that those aren't fluff hours. Those were real hours that were actually worked, honest hours, billed and collectible hours. And that's
a big deal.
Yeah, that was just the way it was.
Yeah.
The only way to do it in my mind, to deliver for the clients that hired us and expected us to do a good job for them, that was what had to be done.
And so this is perfect because that's how I was raised as a young lawyer. That's how I was raised as a person, and that's how a lot of us who are practitioners have the same mentality. That's just how this business works. But what happened? Because you don't work like that now.
No,
You have extraordinary blocks of time off. I think in 2019, you had maybe 6 months off for a variety of reasons. So talk to me about what happened.
Okay. So, there was that Atticus thing that came into my life at one point.
That Atticus thing, it wrecks a lot of good lives.
It does. I'm telling you, it really got into the way of my scheduling. So I transitioned from, my first real thing in Atticus to, I don't know if it was a proof of concept or whatever, is I dared it to work kind of thing. I was not somebody who bought in, to the concepts initially because I was too smart and I knew everything. And so I picked a pretty big, audacious goal of saying, okay, you know what? If this is really true, I'm going to prove to you that this really can't be done. And so my first real dare to myself was to take weekends off, because if everything that Mark was saying was true and everything I'd heard from Atticus was true, then I could be just as effective with weekends off. And I didn't really believe I'd be able to do it. But at the same time, I also know myself, and there was this competition kind of thing. If I dared myself to do it, I had to do my best to make it succeed. And so I started with this idea of taking weekends off. And it was crazy. The first time I did it, it was like just before you went on vacation. Wednesday night, I worked really late, and Thursday night, I worked really late, and Friday night, I was worked really late. But by Saturday, I had Saturday and Sunday off. And then I did it the second week, and I was doing that repeatedly, but my weeks were getting more and more chaotic. And so that caused me to start implementing some of the time management things that I had not mastered, because that really brought to a crisis, this idea that there weren't enough hours for me to do everything I wanted to do. And the only way to cram those into, if I'm going to eliminate this 48-hour period on the weekend, I had to cram the rest of it into the 120 hours during the week. And that required me to use or to improve on my time management skills. And so I worked on doing that. And I, learned little things like having to get my head around this idea of an open door policy was a good thing, because that to me was essential. You had to have an open door policy, because by God, if everything had to be 100% right 100% of the time, you didn't want anybody making mistakes. So anybody who had a question, you had to give priority to that so the work product would be right. And then you take that and you learn that, wait a minute, I can shut my door for periods of time, and I can have a period of time when I'm available to answer questions and things like that. And so I started working on my organizational skills, which made my week less chaotic, still chaotic, but less chaotic than it was. And over time, I got better at being able to do that. And so I mastered the taking weekends off.
Okay. By using positive constraints, you start to notice things in your practice like, oh, I didn't notice that. I didn't notice this. I didn't notice that. And then you start to pay attention, and you also unwind habits. So if you think back, and I know it was a while ago, but can you think back, what was one of the habits that you had to break? Um, you know,
I think probably if I was going to maintain my billable hours and the kind of things, but the expectations, I needed to find a more efficient way to work with less interruptions. And
perfect.
so that was probably the first thing I realized was this, the phone ringing and the being interrupted and the having, and again, because of the transition I had a couple of years later, the firm was a little smaller at this point, which made it a little more manageable. So maybe there were only 8 people in the office, you know, who were all crowding for my time and everything. But I had to learn to be able to shut the door or say, I need an hour, of uninterrupted time or whatever it was. And so that was probably the first place. I don't know that I ever, or at least I learned at that point to, uh, block time for return calls or emails. I think maybe I turned off my email alarms by a certain point, so the Pavlovian response wasn't there to look at the computer and all that. So, I mean, I did little things, but it was definitely a slow process, but it was driven to a large degree because of my stubborn personality was, well, once I'd done the one weekend off, I wasn't going to not be able to do the next weekend. And once I'd done 2 in a row, I wasn't going to be able to. And so it kind of snowballed on that. So, I mean, look, I'm going on 9 years now without having worked a weekend. So it's sort of like, quitting smoking. If you have that one cigarette, you've got to start all over.
It's like untying a big knot. This is not a knot of your own creation, a knot of your own values, your own habits, your own beliefs, and you've got to test your assumptions and take them apart. It's a hard thing. What was the hardest assumption or the hardest belief that you had to test?
For me, I think I I think I approach it with a little bit of a different mentality. It was kind of weird. I am, it's an ancient uh, belief that you have to prepare for when all the walls come crashing in and everything like that. So and what I learned was, what, I was making a really good living and I was making more money than I thought I would be able to make. And for me, it wasn't about just chasing more and more money. It was like having a taste of a little bit of freedom. And that was really what I was started chasing. And when I knew the money was there, then it would be like, well, maybe if I worked a little bit less, maybe I'll only make a little bit less money. And so for me, it was, I learned early on as a family lawyer, from seeing other, because you're in everybody's family and everybody's finances. And so one of the things I learned early on was not grow into your full earnings. And so while my lifestyle has certainly grown as I've earned more, it hasn't grown into what I've earned. And
That's
so
right.
that was nice because that provided a little bit of cushion to allow you to test things and say, look, if it didn't work, I can afford the little bit of a reduction or something like that. So it made me a little more bold in being able to do things. I could try things a little bit different. I became comfortable that the cases would be there and that the practice was working. I learned from some of the people who worked with me. One of my partners, one of the lawyers who works with me, Andrew, always takes Sunday off because that's his family day. It's church and it's everything else. And, Andrew could accomplish what needed to be done without ever working Sundays. And so, that sits in the back of your mind. So I was learning. I was willing to try things. For me, when I did my original My Great Life thing, it was the things that were in there. And I go back to the original one I did in 2014. It was take a 30-day vacation. That was like the goal of my entire, my 10-year goal was take a 30-day vacation. And I didn't believe it could possibly be done. But I wanted it because, pick some big audacious goal or, whatever it is.